All right, we're back. We have Marc Surdyka. Last time you were on, Mark, we started with your cake situation. Do you remember that?
Do, yeah.
Yeah. Within the past 6 to 8 weeks since that, what's been the best dessert you've had?
Well, the thing that's currently on my mind is that Nicole went to some outing last night, got home kind of late, but I guess she snuck some little like cheesecakes and like some other dessert in the fridge. So this morning before I went to the gym, I just downed those. A place that we like is Salt and Straw. So it's like an ice cream place out here, and they have it in Portland and probably all over. But I really like their cinnamon snickerdoodle flavor. And they get like new flavors every month. So
Yeah.
Salt and Straw. Yeah.
When I lived in the Bay, I would crush Salt and Straw. And I don't know if you all have it in California. Frankie and Joe's. Have you heard of that?
Is that ice cream?
Mm-hmm.
No, I have not heard of that.
That's what I've been crushing in Seattle. They have a few locations.
I mean, sometimes like Trader Joe's, their brookies are good. It's like a brownie cookie. They got a really good like horchata ice cream. So,
Wow.
There's plenty of good desserts to eat.
That's true. Any other non-food related updates since we chatted last?
Not that I can think of. How about yourself?
I moved into a new apartment. You're aware of that. That's about it. But that was I was living in a basement. If anyone watches the old videos, they'll see that the lighting was subpar. And now I'm above ground on the 5th floor and have a beautiful view of Mount Rainier. So my day-to-day happiness and ability to see the sun it's a game changer.
Yeah, I bet so.
All right, let's go into the main discussion and topic for today. We are going to try kind of a new format. It's going to be a semi-regular series. I'm not sure we decided on a name yet, but I like the idea of like a debunking series or talking about different topics and hot topics within physical therapy and rehab. And the first one we're going to dive into is the core and core stability. So, Mark, can you start off by trying to define what is the core, or is there even a commonly accepted definition?
I'm going to take even one step back because you used the word debunking. And I thought about like adding this caveat in the summary that we're going to do. But I want people to know that regardless of what I say or what Chris says, we encourage different viewpoints. It's okay to disagree. Like we can disagree on some of these topics and still be friends or not hate one another. You know, my identity isn't tied to my beliefs or understanding of core stability. And I don't want to say that yours, you know, the people listening shouldn't have their identity tied to that either, but probably shouldn't. So even with this topic or other topics that maybe we quote unquote debunk, it's never a personal attack. So talking about the core, and I will say for people watching, if I kind of look away, it's because I do have some notes written down in terms of quotes, authors, papers, etc. So what is the core? As soon as you ask the question, everyone listening to this podcast imagined their version of the core. You know, you probably did too when formulating the questions for this podcast episode. What I recommend, if it's feasible, obviously if you're listening while driving or riding a bicycle, it's not really feasible. But if it is feasible, is for people to press pause after each question you ask and see if they can answer it for themselves with more clarity. You know, expand on your thoughts beyond the initial short answers that come to mind. We made a YouTube video based on a lot of these questions we're going to discuss today. Essentially, we created a Google form and had our audience of PTs, students, coaches, fitness enthusiasts, and everyone in between write out their answers as long or as short as they wanted. And as expected, there was a lot of variability in how people responded. So you asked, what is the core? And it seems like such a simple question, but in reality, we don't have an agreed upon definition anywhere. Someone might say the axial skeleton and everything that comes along with the axial skeleton. But then we might say, okay, so we're including the skull and facial bones. Someone else says, no, we're just referring to the trunk. Okay, so what's the trunk? Is that everything but the head, neck, and limbs? Meaning the thoracic spine, the ribs, the lumbar spine, the sacrum, the coccyx. But then does that include the innominate bones, like the pelvis? And then if you say, well, only the muscles that attach within the trunk, whatever that means, are we ruling out the serratus anterior because it also attaches to the shoulder blade, or the latissimus dorsi because it attaches to the arm, or the psoas major because it attaches to the femur? You know, if, in my mind, if someone says, name a core exercise, for whatever reason, I think of a plank immediately. What exercise do you think of? If someone says, name a core exercise, do you think of anything?
Yeah, some type of isometric or crunch.
Yeah, I don't know why, but that's what I think of, and I'm sure other people have that same thought. And a plank is going to work the abdominals, which everyone might agree is part of the core. But then the hip flexors and the serratus anterior and some of these other muscles come into play. And your legs are working, and your neck is working, and your shoulders are working. And if your shoulders fatigue before your abs, which they do for some people, is it now a shoulder exercise or a core exercise, or is it a combination of the two? So I don't think I have a good answer of, what is the core? In day-to-day discussions, I honestly don't think it matters all that much. If a trainer says to their client, today we're going to work on your legs and core, for me, there's no issue there. I take it to mean that they'll probably do some planks or side planks or sit-ups or something that is generally aiming to work the relative midsection of the body. I think where it becomes problematic is in research, because terms need to be well defined, especially in this era of constant systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And we need to be sure that everyone is talking about the same thing. In clinical practice, I think it matters, in the sense that, like, it makes certain terms and associations and discussions a bit nebulous. Like, if we can't define the core, how do we define core stability? And if we can't define core stability, how do we associate it with back pain, one way or the other? And we're going to get into that. But once again, I don't have a problem with it in most cases. I know some people hate the word. Even if you're a physical therapist working with a patient and you say you want them to do some side planks to work their core, I don't really see an issue with that personally. I think it comes down to the rest of the discussion that we're probably going to have today. What are your thoughts?
I would agree. I rarely change a patient's definition of the core, but I'll tend to use trunk, or maybe a more neutral sounding term that I think comes with maybe a little bit less baggage. I'll say like the trunk musculature or something along those lines, but again, that can be hard to define what that is. So you alluded to core stability. Because we don't have a recognized working definition for the core, is core stability even harder to define and measure?
Yeah, we had a nice little video in the YouTube video. So we made this YouTube video. There's also, a blog from the YouTube video of where we were trying to like layer these definitions one on top of the other. And I kind of gave the analogy that trying to define core stability after having difficulty defining these other things was like trying to lay a brick on top of a pyramid of cards. So it took a long time to film that, because it's actually harder to make a pyramid of cards than you think. You watch these YouTube videos and they're like, oh, just like you do this and you do this, and then you keep stacking and like trying to get even like 8 cards or 10 cards or whatever it is. Was pretty difficult. But I'll start by saying that I don't know, and our survey led me to believe that no one else really does either, or at least nobody really agrees about what core stability is. And so I'm going to read a couple skeptical answers. An overused term based on a poor study regarding low back pain and transversus abdominis activation. A fictional cause of low back pain. A made-up concept that, when detected, allows people to charge for core stabilizing exercises. Some less skeptical answers: sufficient strength to avoid unnecessary, maybe injurious movements of the core. Strong and appropriately activated musculature. And then one more: the flawed idea that the lumbar spine is inherently unstable and that resisting any deviation from a quote unquote neutral spine position, if there is such a thing, by active contraction of the abdominal muscles is essential for minimizing lumbar injuries. And we had a lot of answers for a lot of these questions. Some people told me like, that's a dumb question, for some of these. But we don't have a good definition of the core right now. So we could try to figure out what is stability, right? Because core stability, there's two parts to that phrase. So what is stability? And this is a quote from a paper by Peter Reeves, who is a prominent researcher in the field, and colleagues. This is from 2019. I want to say maybe JOSPT, but this definition also stems back from much further back. So this is what's written. In general terms, stability is tested by applying a small perturbation to a system of interest and observing the new behavior. If the new behavior is approximately the same as the old, then the system is stable. The example they give is a ball in a valley returning to the undisturbed position. When they say valley, they have a picture associated with it. I think of maybe like a skateboard ramp, right? Like a little, I don't know if it's a half pipe, but like if you had a ball in the middle of that and you pushed it either way, eventually it's going to find its way back to the middle. Then the alternative is if the disturbed behavior differs significantly from the old behavior, then the system is unstable. The example is a ball on a hill rolling away following a perturbation. So that's the definition of stability that they give, and in clinical practice, it's probably not that helpful. They do this type of experiment in research sometimes where they'll see if people can resist perturbations or get perturbed and return back to their starting position. But overall, I think it's pretty hard to define core stability. Once again, if you're listening, you disagree with me, no problem. But if that's the case, I encourage you to write down your own definition and then ask your friends, family, colleagues, students, Twitter, Instagram, etc., for their definitions and see how similar or dissimilar they are, because that's what we did. And I've worked with other physical therapists and students and mentors, and I also never received the same definition of what core stability is. Same thing. Any thoughts for you there?
Yeah, it's all over the place. This wasn't in the outline, but I am curious, is it easier to define and measure something like shoulder stability or ankle stability, or does that become very messy and fuzzy, just like core stability?
Yeah, once again, I think it depends on how we're defining stability. We do have this phrase for the ankle, like chronic ankle instability, and there is a definition and a description of what it is. But even then, it's hard to describe. Some people might just say like it's the perception of the patient, like, oh, my ankle feels unstable, right? Like it's like the same thing with the knee after an ACL rupture. Hey, I have instability of the knee. My knee gives out. And maybe we say it and we think about it and we all kind of understand it to some extent. But if we were to write those things out or discuss it with the patient or, look at it across research, it's not always consistent on what that term means.
When you have multiple areas you've talked and discussed this concept of the core and core stability with YouTube, and I know you wrote a chapter on it, and looking it up for this specific episode, did you ever come to a conclusion on when and why this became so popular, this idea of training the core stability? What incited this explosion of this concept?
I'm not a historical expert. I think there are certain papers and individuals that definitely piqued our interest more than others. So Punjabi was someone who did a lot of research as it relates to the lumbar spine and biomechanical modeling. Are you familiar with Punjabi? Did you read any Punjabi in school or anything?
The name sounds familiar. I can't specifically think of some of his papers right now.
Okay. So he discussed 3 distinct components that contribute to the stabilization of the spine: the passive subsystem, vertebrae, discs, ligaments; the active subsystem, muscles, tendons; and the neural control subsystem, nerves and central nervous system. And according to Punjabi, these 3 subsystems work together to achieve stability of the lumbar spine, which, makes enough rational sense. And then his research led him to propose this idea of the neutral zone, which he defines as a region of intervertebral motion around the neutral posture, where little resistance is offered by the passive spinal column. And we can talk about how he came to this conclusion or some of the research that he did. But so then he goes on to state that it may increase with injury, this neutral zone, to the spinal column, or with weakness of the muscles, which in turn may result in spinal instability or a low back problem. So there's the first time we've introduced that term into this podcast episode, really. Instability, right? It's the opposite of stability, which we know is commonly used when discussing low back pain. And then to clarify, what he's describing as a neutral zone is different than what we think of as a neutral spine when describing a bird dog or a deadlift. So that's one person I think that piqued our interest. And yeah, do you want me to describe some of his research more, or just kind of move on? I don't know how relevant it is to the discussion.
We could move on, and if it's relevant, come back to it at some point. How much do you think some of Stu McGill's work played a role with this as well, or the concept of bracing and spine neutral positions?
Yeah, so I think there's still a few other people, and maybe they all kind of occurred together. And I guess maybe it makes sense because people are familiar with McGill's research, probably at least more so than Punjabi. So Punjabi would take a potted lumbar spine, potted meaning like, it's just a dissected lumbar spine. You remove the muscles, you have the ligaments, you put it in this contraption, you have a compressive force on top, like it would be with your body weight. And then he creates moments meaning torques, right? He's trying to create pure moments, pure movements. So moving that spine into flexion, extension, side bend, rotation, and then trying to understand, well, if you create a flexion moment, does the lumbar spine actually flex? Well, yes, it does, as expected. But then he would do that with rotation, right? Like you create a rotation moment, does it also rotate? Yes. But then does it side bend ipsilaterally? Does it side bend contralaterally? Which way do the vertebrae, translate? So anyway, this neutral zone is basically, he has this potted lumbar spine, he has this compressive force on top, and what he sees is that there's movement that's constantly occurring even before he applies a moment. And so then, he's kind of theorizing that, I don't know if he did it in this, experiment, or it was mathematical modeling, or he actually did just theorize it, but like, hey, you have a disc herniation that's going to increase this neutral zone, this like zone of instability without the muscles. So I think another person though that was pretty popular is Bergmark. In 1989, wrote a paper titled "Stability of the Lumbar Spine: A Study in Mechanical Engineering." And I think Punjabi was also a mechanical engineer. And so Bergmark classified the muscles in this region into local and global systems based on their attachments and actions. So think of the global system as muscles like the superficial erectors, spanning multiple spinal segments and acting as prime movers of the spine. In contrast, the local system is made up of smaller, deeper muscles like the multifidus or multifidi. And this is responsible for accommodating intersegmental changes that affect the position and posture of the lumbar spine. So now we're thinking about stability again. And I think if there are physios listening, physical therapy students listening, I'm sure at some point we learned about trying to increase like intersegmental stiffness and stability by localizing contraction of the multifidi, right? So we have these global muscles, the erectors, that probably don't get focused on as much in rehab. And then we have these like, local muscles like the multifidi, which probably, have a bigger emphasis. And then I think people are probably pretty familiar with the work of Paul Hodges and colleagues as it relates to the transversus abdominis, contributing to intervertebral stiffness, acting in a feed forward manner prior to the initiation of limb movement. So like you're about to move your shoulder and your TA, subconsciously activates right before. And then also, this delayed activation in individuals with low back pain. And then, coming to what you asked, I think probably a more prominent model right now, especially on social media. There are certain social media people who often interview Stu McGill and, post them on their social media channels. And I think that's probably one of the more prominent, models.
The idea of this core being stable, or there needs to be a neutral position with daily activities or with increasingly heavier exercises like squats and deadlifts. Is there actually a way to measure that neutral or stable position? We kind of already alluded to it, but maybe elaborating on that. And then does it actually matter with day-to-day tasks, picking up things off the floor, walking, moving? And does it matter with loaded exercises and, more axially compressed type of gym-based movements?
Yeah, for this, I think it depends on how we're defining stability, how we're defining neutral. Like for stability, someone might have a patient do a bird dog, and if they see any deviation from just like any movement, maybe they think it's unstable or less stable, or something like the FMS, where you're graded on these different levels of exercises or activities, and like one of them is an ipsilateral bird dog, right, where you have to do like same arm, same leg, which is really tough. I don't know if they describe that as being stable or unstable, but you can imagine how we might infer that. So it does depend on that. So for neutral, same thing. We could get actual measurements of how much the lumbar spine flexes or extends. I think in the clinic, when someone's doing a movement, we kind of use the eyeball test. And when people are watching other people in the gym or watching them on social media, they're also using the eyeball test. And I think the average person might say that when the back appears flat, maybe a slight curve, but you can still, balance a cup of water on their low back. In quadruped, when they're doing a bird dog or at the bottom of a deadlift, is a neutral spine, right? Like if you look at it, does it look flat? Maybe a slight curve. I think that's what most people are thinking of when they say neutral or neutral spine. And there's different techniques where people try to teach that, right? Like you're probably familiar with getting a dowel and like having the dowel behind your back, your arms attached to the dowel or holding the dowel, and then you're hinging and you're trying to like, maintain certain points of contact with that dowel. Great. That's a neutral spine. That's what we describe as a neutral spine. But there's a lot of research to demonstrate that the spine flexes with squats, deadlifts, kettlebell swings, and other exercises, right, to a pretty significant degree, including research by McGill. So it doesn't mean that you can't brace to try to minimize movement during squats and deadlifts, but it's impossible not to flex the spine, even if the spine looks neutral, or what we're describing as neutral.
And is there any risk of injury when it comes to, you said there's this inherent flexion that will occur whether or not we can see it. If there's more flexion, is that risking or an increased risk of injury? Or if someone doesn't provide some type of conscious bracing and almost Valsalva maneuver, is that increasing the risk of injury?
Yeah, so from a research perspective, you're not going to find much. Once again, that doesn't mean that you can't brace during heavy deadlifts and squats, but it's probably unnecessary and maybe even problematic if you're bracing your core to pick up a pencil or tie your shoes or walk down the block. Now, if you're already injured and in pain and moving in a specific way increases your pain, and bracing or trying to maintain a certain position decreases your pain, then yeah, that's probably a good thing. That's probably fine. But as we know, based on research, people with low back pain often move more rigidly. So like, slower, more hesitantly, through less range of motion, and have certain beliefs about their back. So we just have to make sure that, if we're working with them to move a little bit different so that their back doesn't hurt when they're picking up that pencil from the floor, we're just not reinforcing the idea that we're doing these modifications because their backs are inherently fragile.
That leads into this next conversation surrounding core strength, neutral positions, relating or not relating to chronic or acute low back pain. You mentioned it, but this narrative of a weak or fragile core, is there any association between core strength and acute or chronic low back pain?
I'm sure you could probably find some low quality studies that demonstrate a relationship, but overall, the prospective research just isn't there.
And what you'd mentioned was people that do have low back pain, they tend to move in a more rigid and guarded manner. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it could be from pain, right? If you just sprained your ankle, you're probably going to have less excursion, less total range of motion because it's painful, and you don't want to push into that pain, and you're unsure if you're making that ankle sprain worse or damaging it. So I think just pain in general, and then it could be their beliefs. So whether it's beliefs that they Googled, beliefs that they learned about online, beliefs that they gathered from a clinician in person. If you're told that you need to brace your core and that you need to maintain a neutral spine whenever you're doing day-to-day activities, in order to do that, especially if you're not a well-trained individual, I know you go to the gym pretty regularly. I go to the gym pretty regularly. I can find this quote unquote neutral spinal position pretty easily. But if we take someone who's not a well-trained individual and we're asking them to brace and to maintain this neutral spine, they're going to be thinking about their movements with everything that they do, not only because of the education, but because they probably have this idea that if they don't maintain these positions or this bracing, it's going to injure their low back. And, Louis Gifford has a quote, everybody uses it, but it's because everybody loves it, which is ultimately, we're aiming for thoughtless, fearless movement. So if at the end of rehab, somebody has less low back pain, but now they have to think about everything that they do and their whole life revolves around how they're moving, that's not thoughtless or fearless.
Are there any other common messages you hear either or see on social media or when you were in the clinic that you heard frequently with people, patients and clinicians interactions regarding their messaging around low back pain and this rehab process in regards to core stability, bracing, movement, etc.?
What's interesting is I've worked in different states. Obviously, I've worked with remote clients in different states and different countries. And LA by far is where I hear and I've heard this narrative about this core stability. And I don't know if it's just because of the fitness culture here in LA and, maybe they're with some things they're a little bit more out there, maybe with like nutrition and like their training modalities and whatever it may be. So yeah, for sure. It is interesting, like seeing that it's a cultural thing or a societal thing, and it, might differ depending on where you live. But yeah, common narratives. You have low back pain because your core is weak. As I mentioned, you need to brace your core while walking, even though we know that your abdominals are working very little when you're walking. You have low back pain because your core is unstable. And anything related to the word instability, if you tell a surgeon that a patient has an unstable spine, they're going to prep for surgery. As part of my residency at USC many moons ago now, I shadowed an orthopedic, spinal surgeon, on a weekly basis. And yeah, his reference to the word instability is much different than what we might hear in the clinic or the gym. And taking all of those comments, so you have low back pain because your core is weak, our motto at E3 Rehab is empowerment through evidence-based education. Empowerment, as we have it written on our website, is defined as the process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life. And then another word that we love and use a lot is resilient. And resilient, as we use the term, means the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. So if we're telling people that they're weak and unstable, we're not empowering them. We're not promoting resilience. We're promoting fragility. So you can educate patients and use core exercises as part of their home exercise program without making them feel fragile.
The type of interaction that you've probably encountered multiple times where a patient comes in with low back pain and they're explaining their prior experiences, their current beliefs on why they may be experiencing these symptoms. It's obviously very individual and case dependent, but do you have any advice on navigating those interactions of how to go about potentially addressing some of those less than ideal narratives, maybe over time, and ways you can reframe some of their prior beliefs?
Yeah. First of all, as you said, over time. So this might not be a one visit wonder, right? You can't fix something or whatever it may be in one visit a lot of the times. And you're not trying to be dismissive of that person. So I've probably repeated this a dozen times on this podcast, but I think it's helpful to understand their perspective. So why do they think they have pain? What do they think is going to help? Why do they think it's going to help? Do they believe their back pain is due to weakness or instability? You can ask them what they think contributed to their onset of pain in the first place. You can discuss those ideas together depending on how they're responding. And which we're not really taught, but it's okay to say that you don't know exactly why they developed their back pain in the first place. But based on everything they're telling you, you can come up with a plan that's going to help. And that plan might include core exercises, or as you describe it to your patients, trunk exercises. Not because they're unstable, not because they're weak, but because exercise can be analgesic, or exercise can make them feel more confident with the activities they're worried about doing. Or it serves as a break when they've been sitting for 4 hours straight. There's so many roads that don't involve instilling fragility. I mean, have you had any experiences with patients recently in the clinic or remotely who have already come to you with this idea of maybe their back pain is due to weakness or due to instability, and you've had to navigate that conversation?
Yeah, it feels like on a daily or weekly basis. It's very common. And it gets messy in a clinic where there's a variety of explanations and narratives surrounding this belief. So it's very much trying to frame it without making other providers or other individuals in clinic, or even other, providers outside of the clinic. I don't want to bash other clinicians because that's not helpful. And they probably had years of rapport with those other individuals potentially, or months that, like you said, this is developed over time, and it's almost picking and choosing the battles. And maybe sometimes it's not even necessary to change their beliefs by the time they're discharged. If they feel more comfortable and confident in their body, but they still have certain beliefs, or they feel like they can self-manage over time, I don't think I necessarily have to address all of these things, because it may not be warranted, or it may not really change their day-to-day life.
Yeah, and sometimes showing people does more than telling them, right? I think there's probably like YouTube videos of Peter O'Sullivan asking people to do a movement or activity and like just letting go. And he's not telling them much beyond that. And then they do it and they realize like, oh, I can do this without having back pain. I've done it before, where I had a patient was always wearing like a lumbar brace, thought her low back was super unstable. And at one of the last visits, I had her pick up kettlebells, but she didn't know the weight of the kettlebells. And then I had her pick up whatever the heaviest one was. And I don't remember if I put a piece of tape on it. Maybe I just turned it the other way. She wasn't a regular gym goer, so she didn't know what the weight was. And I asked her, what do you think that weight was that you picked up? And she said something like, 10 pounds. And the kettlebell ended up being like 50 pounds. And it just blew her away that she was able to do that. Now, I'm not saying to go and surprise all your patients by having them, deadlift or pick up some kettlebells or whatever, because obviously if they have acute low back pain, they might need a certain amount of relative rest. But that's just an idea that it's not always about explaining it to them, but showing them what they're capable of also instills resilience and empowers them.
Adding to that, I think I've tried to provide a variety of options as opposed to just removing what they believe is helpful. So explaining that we don't have an ideal series of exercises or positions that we have to do in these scenarios. We can, and then I'll list out a variety of options. And sometimes it's more tailored towards what they want to get back to. They do have specific demands or goals, but I say we can do more of these floor table-based exercises that may provide some temporary relief, or we may do something as general as walking, or we may try some upper body activities or go to group classes. And there's really no right or wrong. We're just kind of having a trial and error and what you value and enjoy. So I can't remember within the past year in clinic of actually demonizing something like a dead bug or a bird dog or some of these traditional, like very low level core stability based exercises. More trying to navigate the variety of other potentials that we could go through, and they can pick and choose, because ultimately if they're in the clinic for a few weeks or a few months, if that's what they enjoy doing at home and I've provided them other options and they end up just liking it, then I'm not going to tell them not to do it.
How many older individuals do you see on a regular basis? I don't want to define older because I don't want to, someone's definitely going to get offended, but
yeah, we have a big skew and spectrum, but I would say half of my caseload on a daily basis is 40 and above, and I have quite a bit of 60, 70, and some 80-year-olds right now.
How many of those 60, 70, and 80-year-olds come to you and describe their morning routine, and it's 20 exercises and 45 minutes or an hour in length? Do you ever get that?
I get a few. I'll actually get that more commonly with some of these like middle-aged 30, 40-year-olds. Some of the older ones, they don't do anything during the day.
So maybe it's an LA thing. But when I would hear that, I wouldn't say, unless they were like, I have no time for anything else. And sometimes that is the case. Someone's doing like 3 hours of exercises every day. But if somebody's in their 70s or 80s and they're telling me this like exercise routine that they do every day and they love it, I'm going to encourage that. I'm like, that's awesome. It's like, stay active. If you're doing something active every day, as you said, it sounds like some of your patients aren't active, and maybe it's harder to get them to be active. So would it make sense if someone's doing this, they love it, it keeps them active, to say, okay, let's get rid of all of this? Because, not everybody wants to go to the gym, not everybody wants to lift weights. You're finding what works for them.
Do you have on the top of your head some of the most elaborate or long routines that a patient has told you? Do you remember any of those?
I couldn't even begin to describe them, because I've seen patients who go from provider to provider, and every provider that they see, they add the exercises. So let's say you go to a doctor, and this doctor actually provides you an exercise handout, right? Like one of those that's like stapled together, and there's like 2 or 3 pages. So you have 2 or 3 pages of exercises, and then they go to the next physical therapist. Next physical therapist never asks them what they were already doing, gives them new exercises. So they get a new handout, then they staple that. And now they got this like long CV of exercise handouts. And, I ask, okay, what are you currently doing? And they bring this in, and, depending on the patient, like I like to joke, and I might like drop my jaw and be like, how long does that take you? Right. And someone might say like 3 hours. So then part of our plan is not to dismiss all of those exercises and get rid of them all in a day, but how can we reorganize this to be a little bit more productive, and, get to the bottom of why they think they need to do 3 hours of exercises from 5 different providers over the past 2 years. So yeah, I mean, I've seen some pretty crazy routines.
I I have had experiences like that, and I will just ask what out of those actually provides benefit to you, or do you feel like is actually helping? And then sometimes if they struggle to clearly define which ones are helping, then I may say, what are your thoughts on us reducing some of these activities? And there's like relief a lot of the times, because they felt like it's been ingrained in them that they have to do this for the rest of your life.
Yeah. Like I said, I love injecting humor. Like, tell me which ones of these that you hate. Like, which exercises do you hate? Like, do you loathe doing every day? And if they're doing 40 exercises, I guarantee there's some exercises that they hate in there that they probably don't need to be doing.
100%. So maybe if you feel like we've hit on this enough, we can move on. But can you give any situations in which you can make an argument for these more low-level activities being initially prescribed, such as a bird dog or a dead bug or something that may, when you think about it, can be used as a have a poor narrative associated with it of why they're doing it? But are there any times in clinic or that you can think of that is a valid reason to use this as a beginning or entry point for patients?
Sure. Someone has a strong preference for bird dogs and it makes them feel better, and they'd rather do bird dogs and go for a walk after they've been sitting for 4 hours straight. Why not? If that's what they want to do. And I don't dismiss the idea that the low back benefits from preparation in certain scenarios. I don't know if, dead bugs and bird dogs and some of these lower level exercises are the best for preparation. But if someone injures their knee, we're all jumping at the opportunity to strengthen their quads, right? Like, we love it. You have an injured knee, we're strengthening those quads. Now, does the quad strengthening automatically correlate with a decrease in pain? No, but it's probably, it probably means that they can go up and down stairs better. So if exercise can improve someone's function for their day-to-day tasks, why not include it? So I think sometimes we dismiss the idea of preparation for the low back because of how it's often tied into these narratives of instability or fragility. But if we disconnect those narratives, it might make a little bit more sense. An example for me is that, like, if I don't do weighted side bends for a while, like on a Roman chair, you're sideways on a Roman chair and you're, side bending. And then I jump back into them while throwing caution to the wind. It's not fun. So I did this a month or so ago where I hadn't done them for several months. Took a 50 or 60 pound dumbbell and did sets of 8 to 10 with a deep stretch at the bottom, pushing near failure. And then I could not move the next couple of days. Like it hurt. It was not fun. And like, not, I don't know. It's a different hurt than like your quads being sore, or your calves being sore. Like I was like, man, but if I build up to them progressively over time, I don't even get sore. So not everybody needs structured exercise, but some people might benefit from increasing their preparation and feeling more confident. And I think, we do have this idea that 90% of back pain is nonspecific. What does nonspecific mean? It's that 10% of back pain is the big bad uglies, the fractures and the cancers and things like that require, more immediate medical attention. So then this other 90% is nonspecific. And we say nonspecific because it can be really hard to accurately provide a pathoanatomical diagnosis. Pathoanatomical relating to like the actual muscle or ligament or tendon or whatever might be injured. That's not to say that someone can't sprain a ligament in their low back or they can't strain a muscle. Like those are still things that happen. Just because we can't necessarily diagnose it doesn't mean that we can't say, hey, maybe in your mind you're thinking, okay, maybe they pushed a little bit too hard. Maybe they sprained something. Maybe they strained something. Like, hey, load management is going to be the way to go for this person who's lifting in the gym. But you might also say, you know what? I think you might benefit from some Roman chair back extensions or some reverse hyperextensions in the form of appropriate preparation. Once again, to me, that's empowerment. We're promoting that resilient, like I said, as another word for toughness. We're promoting that toughness. We're not saying you got hurt because your back is weak or you got hurt because your core is unstable. It's, you know what? Maybe you pushed a little bit too hard. Let's get you back to where you need to be. So we reduce the possibility of this happening again in the future. I don't know if your take on that, if you disagree, but I think, like I said, I think sometimes we do dismiss the idea that, we don't ever need to do any kind of preparation for the low back.
I would agree. And that leads into the next conversation surrounding times where you think, whether it's the low back or any part of the trunk or core musculature, should be directly trained from a sport standpoint. So outside of this acute or chronic low back pain, providing a variety of options and entry points for reducing some symptoms and getting back to day or taking some breaks throughout the day. What are some examples that you have of times where, based off the demands or the sports, there should be a little bit more specificity of these trunk related tissues that would benefit as a zooming out, looking at the big compound lifts, other power-based activities? You have all these other things in an S&C program. Where do you see these more isolated based trunk training coming in and being valuable?
I think it depends on your goals, right? If you're willing to do biceps curls because you're trying to maximize the strength and size of your biceps, because you could be doing pull-ups and rows and all of these exercises and be jacked and have jacked biceps. But if you wanted to have maybe even a little bit more jacked biceps, some direct training through a full range of motion, it's probably going to do a little bit more for you than just those compound movements. And so, why can't we apply that same logic to your abs or low back? So for me, I'm never going to have the ab genetics of, whatever top bodybuilder. And I can have visible abs by doing everything else that I do in the gym and maintaining a good diet and exercising. But if I want those abs maybe to be a little bit more visible or more muscular, then probably makes sense to do some direct training, for them. In terms of sports, I think there might be some obvious examples like gymnastics, right? So gymnasts probably wouldn't be able to perform their amazing feats of strength without the endless hollow body holds and the other core training that they do or trunk training that they do. And then, I don't know, for other sports, I think we could probably argue that if increased force production of specific muscles in a specific direction leads to increased performance, then trying to increase that force production through this direct core trunk training makes sense. The problem is it's really hard to measure and quantify. Like if we're thinking about baseball players or boxers or the ones who are hitting the hardest or punching the hardest, is it because of their core strength? Is it because of their hip strength? How is that being measured? Right? Like obviously we know a lot of that power is being driven by the legs, but I don't know. Boxers do endless sit-ups, and is a sit-ups going to contribute to their punches like regular sit-ups? Maybe not, but then maybe they also argue that it's to help them with their own like force absorption, right? Like more muscle there to protect their organs and better contractions when they get punched. They can try to minimize that. I don't know, but that's what I would think. Like if we could try to argue for whatever sport that we could increase force production reliably, and that increased force production potentially could lead to an increase in performance, then to me that makes sense. I obviously with the bodybuilding example or like the biceps example, that was more of an aesthetic reason. But even calisthenics, like if you're trying to do a flagpole where you're holding on to a pole with two arms and your legs are out to the side, like that requires a lot of core strength, and just doing squats and deadlifts isn't, you're not going to get there.
What about these anti-rotation or side bending or extension based activities like farmer's carries or single arm suitcase carries, things where, I mean, you could even consider it just planks or any of these positions where you're trying to avoid change in position? What do you think is actually occurring there? Do you think there's carryover to other tasks, or do you think they're just getting better at those said exercises?
Yeah, that's hard. One question we didn't talk about that we did ask in the YouTube video is, what is the role of the core? And then so we got those answers, and some of them seem like they were, I don't know, born of some of McGill's ideas, where it's like, hey, we got to resist movement. And I'm not saying that that's what McGill says, but maybe that's how some people interpret it. But hey, the core is there to resist movement. And then somebody else would say, well, the core is there to produce movement. And someone else would say, well, it's to resist and produce movement. And then someone else said, well, it's to resist movement, produce movement, but it also aids in respiration and, some of these other bodily functions. And it's probably going to do everything. So is there transfer from a side plank? Let's give the example. So, because we see it all the time, right? Like a side plank hold, a curl up isometric, and a bird dog isometric. Is there going to be a direct transfer to squatting and deadlifting there? My intuition would say probably not, because if somebody is lifting a significant amount of weight in the form of a squat and deadlift, those lower level exercises probably aren't sufficient to make a huge difference, and they're not very task specific. Once again, this is hard to, there's not a lot of research on this, and I'm not opposed to those things. Like sometimes I'll do some, anti movement, some isometrics as part of a, well-rounded training routine. You just have to make sure, just like any other exercise, if you're trying to get appropriate adaptations from them, that you should make sure that they're at an appropriate intensity. Like the guy who has the world record for planks and he can hold it for 5 hours, he's probably not getting much out of the plank. It's probably time to make the exercise a little bit harder. So once again, I'm not I'm not opposed to including them in a training routine, and I've done it for myself. I've done it for clients. What about you? You hate them? You hate planks? You hate side planks?
No, I'm open to them. I'll frame it, and I don't know if it's a good. I don't know if I could see myself using this long term, or if I'll change my opinion on it soon. It's trying to describe to patients why we're doing certain activities, and I'll frame it as whether it's the spine or the low back or the shoulder. I'll explain why we're attempting or experimenting with these variety of movements, saying that this part of your body can and probably should move in a variety of positions and hold a variety of loads at a variety of speeds. And we just want to check the boxes and see if you can tolerate that at this point in time. And if there's anything we find that is a discrepancy, it can be just something for us to move towards. But then it's like, well, then does that always have to be a part of their program? Like, do they have to check all these boxes? So it's like, I don't know. For the low back, for example, it's like, well, maybe they should be able to at least hold an isometric position, whether it's a plank or a side plank or a farmer's carry for some period of time. They should be able to feel comfortable flexing over and extending and doing compound activities. But is that actually reducing their chance or creating resilience in them in the future? Or is it just as likely a year down the road for them to have another occurrence, because the highest predictor of low back pain is previous episode? So I am trying to figure out my messaging and how to frame it in the sense of you probably should have capabilities in all of these positions and domains, but also not providing strong statements that this is going to completely reduce any future chances of flare-ups.
And those are entry points, right? Like if you start with the plank, it's maybe kind of, well, it could be high load depending on the person, but it's like, maybe low load, low threat. There's less to think about. And then so far, we've only talked about lower level isometrics, but I don't like, you could be on like a GHD machine and like hold a sit up where the padding is like closer to your butt, and it's really hard, and you hold a weight overhead, right? Or you hold your back, you flip around and you're doing extension, but you're just holding that. Like those are hard. Holding extension, that's a hard position. Once again, is there carryover? Maybe for some things, I'm not sure. Nicole and I will walk to Trader Joe's often. It's probably a little bit more than a mile round trip, and I'm carrying, like grocery bags or the little tote bags asymmetrically, from Trader Joe's and back. That's my suitcase carries or my farmer's carries. I don't know. Like I don't do any. I don't do anything to train that in the gym. So maybe everything else that I do prepares me for that.
Do you have or did you, when you were more frequent in clinic providing care, have a standard way to test some of the musculature of the trunk and the core? There's been multiple episodes we've had on with clinicians and researchers discussing shoulder testing and quad testing, and there's good rationale for testing it and checking it over time and having like endpoints of what our goal is. But from a trunk standpoint, if someone comes in with low back pain, is there anything that you commonly measure often, or is it much more patient specific and like goal and activity dependent?
I do think it's more patient specific and activity goal dependent, but it's not to say that you can't do those things and that I haven't done those things. It's hard to say, as you said, once you get to a 60-second plank, your low back pain is going to be gone or diminished. But it's really nice to do different tests, whatever they are, when provided with the appropriate narrative. So not doing the test because you think they're unstable, but then giving them a goal and educating them appropriately of like, hey, let's see if we can improve this over time. Let's see if we can get you stronger over time, get you more confident over time. And so, yeah, why not? Like, it doesn't even have to be a set goal. Let's see what you can do for a plank the first day. Okay, you only hold it for 20 seconds. Okay, let's see what you can do for a side plank. Let's see what you can do for, the Sorensen. So the Sorensen is basically an isometric, back extension. And there are normative values for some of these things. Some clinics have the Roman chair that adjusts. So like you can make the person pretty vertical and you have them, hold back extension, and it's relatively easy, but it could be hard for them. And then the goal is, hey, over time, let's lower that down and increase that back extension endurance. So I think it varies.
I've heard Eric Meta discuss the like mid shin or mid thigh pull for patients that are apprehensive. And I don't know if he tracks it over time, but he'll use it initially for people who are guarded or hesitant to lift anything. And he'll have them isometrically push against it. And let's say it's 70 pounds. He'll say, are you okay if we pick up 20 pounds, a third of this or a fourth, whatever it is? So I've messed around with that, but I haven't come to any standards for each low back pain eval and treatment. This is going to be my standard series of exercises and checklists. And a lot of it goes more to zooming out and big picture. What is your current routine outside of here? If there is one, is there anything you're currently not doing that you want to get back to? And can we create a well-rounded general fitness and exercise plan? And I think that will provide more long-term systemic benefits as opposed to these 4 exercises that I'm going to send to you on HEP to go.
Yeah. And it's probably hard to find a good balance, right? Because we do have maybe one side of the continuum that hyper focuses on certain exercises and certain movements. And if you can't do it appropriately, you have an unstable core. And then maybe this other side that says like, do whatever, it doesn't matter. But maybe in some cases, like we've already alluded to, and you kind of mentioned that like maybe it does matter to some extent, and having those numbers for the Sorensen or some kind of back extension or a mid thigh pull, shin pull, like maybe those are helpful because maybe that person would benefit from more preparation for whatever the task that is that they want to do, gives them more confidence, or once again, it's just something to track over time, just to say, hey, we're going to do what we can to create a plan to improve your pain over time. Let's also have some of these other goals. Like let's see if we can chase these other goals. We don't know if hitting a certain number for your plank or your side whatever it is, like we don't know if hitting a certain number is going to correlate with a decrease in pain, but at least we know that your function is improving from at least these standpoints. Or if, like you said, if you're doing it more like task based, at least we know that your squat's getting better or your deadlift is getting better or whatever.
Okay, wrapping up, we talked about a lot. What are the biggest takeaways and summary points that you want our listeners to leave with, Mark?
Chris, I've talked a lot. And if you know me, and I think you're starting to get to know me better, I don't like hearing myself talk that much. So I'm going to pitch this one to you. Like, I don't know if you learned anything. Maybe I presented a paper that you hadn't heard about or something. But yeah, how would you summarize what I've done most of the talking, I guess? But like, how would you summarize what we discussed today?
Yeah, I would maybe break it out into 2 or 3 main areas of the difficulty establishing clear definitions for these commonly talked about and discussed things in health and rehab of the core and core stability, and maybe leaving with this uncertainty that we don't truly have a good way to define this across the research and across day-to-day practice. So I would leave with knowing that we probably should speak with less confidence on what the core is and not assuming that each individual has the same working definition. And then the uncertainty or the acknowledgement that there's not one right or wrong position that is going to lead to inherent injury with day-to-day movements and exercise. And there should be less of a strong narrative surrounding the stability and the bracing portion of the core or exercise in general. And then playing devil's advocate of there is value in some of these more traditional lower level activities, and it's based on more framing what it is and is not doing, and it being an entry point for other activities, and not demonizing it just because it may not be doing what we think it's doing.
That was a better summary than what I could have done. Like, for me, if you want to incorporate trunk exercises as a trainer, as a coach, as a physio, I have no problem with that. It's always about what words, really, you attach to that trunk training. And say it again, we're about, empowerment, promoting resilience. And if you're not doing those things, or at least trying to do those things, and instead promoting fragility, whether it's purposefully or not, that might be something that you just reflect on. Because, I think it's important we're not only working with patients in the moment or throughout their plan of care, like they're going to take what we teach them and what we've said with them, perhaps for months, years, or the rest of their lives.
All right, we'll call it there. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks for having me back.